So today is a very special conversation and the brainchild of Noel. So I would like to invite Noel up here to introduce our special guest speakers.
Okay, aloha, Galina Maine. So thank you so much again for that intro. So we have something called the Dan and Maggie Inouye Chair for Democratic Ideals, and we're really pleased this year to have Gina Apostol. So many things to say about her, but I will say that she gave a keynote recently, and in the 10 years that I've been associated with the Inouye chair, it was by far one of the best, most electrifying talks that I've ever heard. So if there was Ring of Fire, I don't want to take everybody's time reading the official bio here, but just know that she's a brilliant novelist, very prolific, writes a lot about women and revolution in the Philippines. And what we try to do this year is to bring our speakers into conversation with faculty or community here. And so today we're pleased to have Gina in conversation with Joyce Mariano, who is one of our professors in American Studies, whose specialty is Philippine diaspora and Philippine studies. So I don't want to really take any more time. I just really want to turn it over to them as I talk about women in war, bodies and minds as sites of resistance in novels.
Okay, I have to do something here.
You good?
I have to turn this on.
You on?
Okay,
Are we on?
does this work?
Are we on?
Can you hear me?
Can we hear you?
Okay, great.
Thanks, Noel. And thank you to the organizers. If the goal was about building intellectual, engaged intellectual communities and fostering relationships, for me personally, I would say this series has already been a success. So I'm grateful. Thank you, Noel, Ethan, and Hedgen. Gina Apostol, hi.
Hello.
So every encounter that we've had has
had poke.
Has had poke,
yes,
from off the hook, gold ginger, but they've all left me stunned by your generosity and joyfulness, and it's evident not only in your public engagements but just in your overall way of being. So engaging in conversations with you this semester has been a real pleasure, and I'm excited for this chance to delve deeper into topics that you've touched upon in our conversations and in your events and in your writings. So
beware.
So beware. I told her to make it a little rowdy. So I asked the organizers to create a slide of the title of today's event and the images of your book covers, because I've been enthralled by the urgency and reach of your political commitments and the specific ways in your novels that you've created these worlds and characters and these devices for this broader historical and political exploration and confrontation. So we're not here to talk about a specific book, but I wanted to just ask you broadly and in general about what would you say that books do? And what is it about books that you feel most passionate about in terms of their potential to influence the world?
Oh, okay, books. What books should do? Well, for me, my very first novel was about reading, and they tell you to write what you know, write what you're interested in, and so I wrote about reading and fucking, and I put them together, and there was something about my world as a child growing up in Tacloban, this very small town. It is the capital of Leyte on the eastern side of the Philippines, but it's a very small town, and all I did was read. I was so bored. I would read the encyclopedia, I would read the dictionary, And I think the act of reading, which is really central to the making of books, is part of the way I try to think about activism and ways of being in the world. Because the act of reading is an act of attention. It is a very close attention to language, to someone else's ways of being, of thinking, and that attention to both language and how another considers the world, I think is really important in just our daily ways of being with each other, you know? Close attention to the other, listening. And I think reading is that. So the making of books for me is an aspect for me of what I think is an activist orientation to books, which is a close attention to some other thing beyond oneself. I think that's where one aspect of my books too is that I think about the reader a lot, mainly to confuse them, mainly to make them think about why they're reading my goddamn book. So there is complexity in my books, but that the move into making the reader conscious that they have a text before them is really part of my feeling that juggling oneself out of the egoism of consciousness and just moving into a more, I think, healthy space of thinking about why am I here, why is this book before me, what is going on in the world, what am I being asked to do, being very conscious about what you're being asked to do. So that's an aspect of my books that I think is important. In terms of this thinking about how moving in the world.
Yeah, so how reality, including ideas of the self, is constructed.
And you're being made to be conscious of that reality as you're reading.
There's a way that this makes me, this idea, being conscious of the self and its construction, this makes me think about ideas of authenticity and, gatekeeping in the name of national belonging and maintaining these hierarchies through access to these ideas of authenticity. And it seems to me that you just don't really have time for that kind of thing, just in general. But, one of the ways that you delve into the rejection of the imposition of authenticity and the terms upon which authenticity, is wielded and weaponized, is what you're saying is through language, right? And specifically, at least in a couple of your books, Raimundo Mata, Insurrecto, this is also done through acts of translation and mistranslation, characters who are translated and these ridiculous fights over translation. But could you speak more to these kinds of ideas of authenticity and language in your writing approach and practice?
I think it has to do really, in terms of authenticity, I think about ways in which you're just confronted with what seems the norm. And especially through language. As someone who, I grew up, I'm Warai. And that is not necessarily a way to introduce yourself in the Philippines. I'm Warai. It's a nothing thing. But I'm Warai. I grew up in Tacloban learning in English, and you're very, very aware of a norm out there because your language is subsumed under this hegemonic thing, this education through English, and then it's also subsumed through this other hegemonic thing, which is Tagalog, and I have no qualms about speaking English or speaking Tagalog. I don't quarrel with what's given to me because I didn't colonize myself. I mean, other groups did the violence, not Tagalog. I would say Tagalog, that's a different issue. The issue that Warais have with Tagalog is different. But recognizing these hegemonic norms from where I've always been as someone from this small island has made me kind of work through those norms. So maybe that concept of authenticity has to do with more like hegemony and being kind of aware from the start, given the way one's educated, thinking about language, and that's why every single novel that I've written is actually thinking through of the ways in which language constructs us. Every single book, from Bibliolepsy, which is about reading, to Gun Dealer's Daughter, which is a so-called talambuhay biography of someone whose position in the world destroys the world. And what is it that the language of this highly bourgeois, destructive class position of Saul in Gun Dealer's Daughter, what is it that her language does? She only speaks in English. So all of these things, so language is very much part of my work through this so-called authenticity, thinking through hegemonic norms.
I'm what I.
Yeah.
Like that's, I mean, it's a choice.
It's very deliberate.
It's a very deliberate choice. It's about, it's about the way that language constructs us, but that you carry it with you in these everyday aspects, and that how you are aware of being an outsider status then mediates social events, writerly talks, all of it. I mean, could you say more about?
Could I just say this about an outsider status? I don't feel sad. And there's a whole thing about trauma and outsider. I don't have a sense of horror or sadness. I just think that the horror lies in the other person. The horror lies in the like riding a taxi the other day, riding the Uber the other day, and the lady says to me, "Oh, you speak very good English for a Filipino." And you know, for me, the horror lies with that. The horror lies with that other person.
Yeah.
You know, I think that. That I'm constantly confronted with the nightmare that is the world of the white person for me, and I just see that I see them as people who should see that the trauma is theirs, the wound is their ignorance and their blindness. And my work is a work, as you say, it's a work of joy. Most of it is just funny bullshit stuff that I do. They're just jokes, you know. Almost all of my novels are jokes. So what was it that you wanted to ask me about?
Well, about, you know, like what's specific about, you know, that you are prepared to encounter a world that would laugh at you, but very specific. But what's specific to Warai that is? Oh
yeah, okay. Here's the problem. Imelda Marcos is Warai. She grew up in my hometown. She grew up in obviously in my hometown. She went to my school. And part of the thing regarding Warai growing up during martial law era is that you had to deal with this bullshit of this woman who is the representation of Warai. And I refuse, you know, that image of me, you know. So I will wear the mestiza dress that Imelda also wears. I mean, like, you can't make the one, you know, the representative of all. And to be honest, my province is still very Imeldific. You know, they probably all voted for her. But my experience of, it's just my experience of being someone growing up from a particular place, and I think I have, my attachment to it is profound, I think, because it's my mother's place. And I think the attachment that anyone has to a place or a thing or a group that so binds you must be given its center and its prominence in the work that you do if you so wish. Especially in our places, in our spaces here, in the imperial places, in the capitalist places that so diminish what for so many of us is our center. And I think, and I've been doing this since I was a kid, I think to diminish any aspect of my center, even if, something is very diminishable, because fuck Imelda, no? Is problematic for me,
Right.
So I try to find, and if you think about also, in any of our places, the way I read the world is to find the place that's liberatory. So there might be something really annoying. Let's say, okay, my students right now reading Jose Rizal thinking, oh, but he's like bourgeois, it's all of this and all that. You find the space in the text that moves one into greater freedom and justice. You don't sit, oh, okay, Tolstoy, full of whatever. No, find the places in Tolstoy. There are other things going on in Tolstoy. I'm always looking for the liberatory part. And so that's also kind of what I try to do with in thinking about. I forgot your question anyhow. So.
Okay, I'm going to ask a different question. So, I'm really drawn to your novels as acts of decolonial remembering. So thinking about the ethics of history and memory.
Okay.
And
that's good, because that brings back to the question why I brought up Waray, because so Waray is Imelda, but Waray is also one of the last some of the last places that surrendered during the Philippine-American War. Samar and Leyte. So those are places of huge resistance. And during the martial law era, Samar was a place of war, because the people there who were so poor kept fighting the regime. So the New People's Army, the Communist Party, they were very much, it was very kind of scary actually to go through Samar. So it's a place of resistance. So find those liberatory places. That's what I do. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was just, if you could talk more about, this is Samar, this is your mom, and this is also how you represent yourself as Waray. So, just talking more about that inseparability of memory, whether it's personal, family, collective, and national memory.
Right. Yeah, so one thing that I do with my novels, I always try to find a space that I would have intimacy with. So I always have a Waray in my novels. And in doing this, when I was doing the Filipino-American War, for instance, with Insurrecto and La Tercera, what I ended up doing was really looking at Balangiga, Eastern Samar. Balangiga, Samar and Leyte are both Waray places. Eastern Samar, Balangiga, is a place where in 1901, 48 Americans were killed by Filipinos. Therefore, Americans killed 30,000 Filipinos. They burned Samar. Very famously, it was called the Howling Wilderness Edict of General Jacob Smith. And so I ended up really researching that piece, and it's great because what you do when you're doing that kind of research is you're really looking at the people, the scholars of your own group. If you're in Manila, the tendency is to do, Tagalog scholars. But because I was researching Balangiga, I read a lot of Waray scholars. And so it was very cool. And so in thinking about spaces of resistance, if you're going to do something like Tacloban or Waray, you are necessarily going to find those people who are not known. So Kasiana Nacionales. Okay. Shall I wait?
Sorry,
okay.
I interrupted.
So I went to Balangiga and I saw Balangiga is interesting. They have a memorial that includes both the names of the Americans who were killed and the Filipinos who rose up against the Americans. So there are all these names, and there was one name of a woman, Kasiana Nacionales, and it's a beautiful name. Nacionales, what are you going to do, and Kasiana. So I asked about her, and they said they her family was still living apparently in Balangiga, because of course the Filipinos, the Balangiga people who knew about the raid that they were going to do, managed to escape. As the historian said to me in Balangiga, sorry they didn't tell their neighbors. So the Nacionalist family remained, almost all of those families. But anyway, so I ended up looking at this one woman and her story through the records of the Waray scholars. So that's what happened. So I end up doing that, looking at those spaces that are not seen in these revolutionary moments, because our revolutions do tend, our nation making does tend to be quite exclusive at times, you know, like the patriarchal, masculinist reading of nation here in the States or in the Philippines, where you only see the guys, when you know very well the women were cooking their food, the women were fighting were part of the war, etc., but they're not named. So I tend to look at those spaces of those not named. I did not go and talk to the Nacionalist family.
No? What's their reputation? Like, why?
No, I never like to talk to the actual people, because I need to reserve my imagination.
Yeah.
And I know that if I actually met any of the Nacionalist family, I'd just try to follow their story. And it's like, I'd want to be very kind to them and nice to them, and I don't know if I necessarily need that if I'm a novelist. You know, you always have to have the space to fuck someone over.
Right. You didn't want to be obligated to the family history.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I mean that is what, you know, you like to play with history.
Yes.
And that relationship between fact and fiction.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, she is one of the few women who appear in the historical record of the Philippines.
With a name, yeah.
And she had a
She was called the Jeronima. She was called the Jeronima.
Yeah. Wasn't that her middle name?
No, that's just a made-up name, yeah.
Oh.
Yeah. Jeronima Balangiga. You can see there the Native American and Filipino world coming together in Jeronima.
I have an unnamed Jeronima. You know, maybe you don't want to expand on this, but I was going to ask you about, you know, both, could you tell us about Kasiana's story in the war, but as well as your approach to imagining Kasiana in
my novel, Thank you. No one ever asked that, you know. So Kasiana, there are very few things known about her. That's one thing that I discovered. When I asked them, where is she buried? What did she do? No one knows where she was buried, and it's not clear exactly what she did. What is in the myth making of the Balangiga event is that she held a rosary. Mm-hmm. And her lassoing of the rosary, she does it like a lasso, is a signal for the bell to be rung, and for the Filipino men who were hiding in the church and wearing their, this is the story that they like to tell, wearing women's outfits so that the Americans would think that the women were at mass, because it's a rape story. And I really don't like rape stories, so I really, I find the masculine authorship of the rape story of the Philippines like weird. Anyway, there is a story of assault, and of a different woman, but I tried to kind of include the story of assault through the voice of a woman who absolutely takes on a consciousness of, don't you dare do that to my body, or I will fuck you if I want to, you know. So there's this whole, so I gave her a voice of a woman who has control of her body, who is saying bullshit things to what you call this, misdirect the American soldier, who is seemingly her lover boy, and her whole job is misdirection, because when you are the misdirector director, in both senses of that word, misdirector and misdirecting, directing. So she's directing the drama of how they're going to get to the hills, how are the women going to leave their clothes, and she's the one who tells the parish priest exactly what needs to be done. So I gave her, the characteristics of my family, because they're very annoying, they're very bossy, and they're all women. So I could simply imagine these women going, like I could imagine my aunts going, I'm not going to have sex with you until you kill those Americans, you know. And so that kind of voice in my head of very strong women, my family, I grew up with women bossing the world. So, and I'm not saying this in the sense that they were bosses. You know, these were wives. These were people who were clerks in a bank. But my sense of their centering of their desire is very strong. So I have these women who center their own desire, and I refuse foregrounding the rape stories in war. I don't like it.
I'm going to continue with bodies and desires.
Yeah.
Bodies and minds. So, I see that title with women, resistance, bodies and minds, and it makes me want to ask a question about bibliolepsy. You know where I'm going with that.
Yeah, okay.
So bibliolepsy, amidst the backdrop of resistance to the Marcos dictatorship, the protagonist, Primi Peregrino, is obsessed with having sex, specifically with authors.
Yeah.
And so I went to find a description of this to present,
You know what I'll do? I have a section if you want me to read it.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, I'll read this section. It's with one of the poets that she goes out with. Let's call the next poet Huevo Santo, Mr. Holy Eggs. He was a huge man in a rage. I met him at the usual somnambulist cafe. He had a cigarette in his mouth like a dagger, or was that a sword in his eye? No matter. You might get the picture. Hefty man, barong Tagalog, lotion skin and bitter sneer. He wore contact lenses. He had a gold watch. He hated readers and militants. They were his plague. All readers are buffoons, he told me, and the worst buffoons are those who believe in a cause. It's best for a man not to write, but if he wrote, it's best for a man not to publish, and if he publishes, it's best for him to spit at everyone who ventures to talk about his books. And he spat smoke out onto the left region of my shoulders. All talk is cheap, he said, such as yours, I pointed out, and the talk of readers, they're the worst. He would list to me his other woes. Wives too, he told me. I hate wives, and I hate their children. And then you must hate yourself, I said peaceably. You were someone's child. She was no one's wife, he retorted. Mr. Holy Eggs was a government factotum, literary force, an enormous bore. Through the years, as his influence grew larger, so had his body mass. You might say he bloated as his country declined. He was behind many of the dictator's acts of bad faith, serious injury, and malicious regard. He was one of the regime's writers and polemicists. He had his own travails. In the Byzantine tract of the dictator's court, he was sometimes favored, sometimes not. He was nobody's fool and everyone's crank. He was vicious, reptilian, and unlovable. He deserved to be fucked over, and I did. For those who have wondered what it is like to be saddled by a very gross man, let me tell you, it is not easy. Sideways or horizontal on a bed, it cannot be done. Fat overwhelms geometry. If you climbed over him, you'd simply sway. There are two ways to do it, both tricky, requiring the logistics of stamina and invention. You could do it on the edge of a bed, his body prone and yourself upright. The Kama Sutra advises you to hold tightly in a contraction known as a pair of pincers. You'd need first to ram yourself through his thighs, iron fat, in the same impossible position as Moses parting the waters, or failing that, you could straddle him above the thighs, gingerly holding on, while you move backwards perpendicular to his matter. Either way, in the room's harsh light, it was a pathetic scene. I've long figured this out. Sex requires gravity, not beauty. I've been happy with men who look like horses, pollywogs, and even some creatures from other phyla. Beauty is not necessary. It is levity that destroys desire. And when I broke out in laughter at this beached, stripped, cacoethical marlin, this pallid ichthyosaur, Mr. Huevo Santo, who snorted to a humming in his head and displayed so nakedly some horrors of the dictatorship, the cellulite streams of dissipation, like the scars of slackened virtue, the red tumorous folds of unchecked appetite, the fetid smell of holy balls, like the noxious gills of a very dead fish, and finally, the small, tinily upright figure at the center of the squalid altar, forgive me. Faced with the state of the nation, all I could do was look down and laugh. Yes. I went to so many book events with people like that, with these very gross people with, hands.
Right.
Yeah.
Fat fingers, and all you're seeing is sex. I'm sorry. I'm reorienting for a second. Give me a moment.
Well, bibliolepsy is all that.
Yeah.
That's just a series of that.
Well, I mean, I in a couple interviews about bibliolepsy.
It was my first novel, too.
I know, you were 19.
Yeah, I was just going after my friends.
I did see this one description that, as the Marcos dictatorship.
And I love my friends, by the way.
They wrote about it that, Primi, as a vagabond from history, a runaway from time, can be saved by sex, love, and books. And I was wondering if you could say more about being a vagabond from history, a runaway from time, and can sex, love, and books save us all?
Well, the thing about bibliolepsy is that I started writing it when I was very young. So I was around 19 years old. I was still in college. And then, Aquino was killed around that time. And then suddenly the whole country, and I mentioned this in the speech, was out on the streets, especially in 1985, 86. The lead up to the snap election in 86. And it was very interesting to me that suddenly the whole country, or not the whole country, because obviously my mother and her cohorts were not into it. So there was a lot of activism going on, and it was very interesting to me to think about the kind of activism we were doing before this was happening, and how it was, workers, students, labor people, doing stuff at factories, doing stuff with students. And then this became like a very bourgeois revolution. It was very Makati. There were a lot of all these other people. There was very religious too. And there was something about me that, I grew up a little bit Maoist, like somewhat Maoist, in the sense that my university was very much what they call national democratic in its orientation. And I still absolutely think that this focus on labor relations, worker relations, farmers, land reform is really central to justice and democracy in the Philippines. So at the same time that I joined the marches for this more bourgeois kind of thing that was going on. But I think my novel, Bibliolepsy, sets up a little bit of the fact that there are multiple ways to engage and be part of movements, and to engage in a group that I wasn't so interested in was also important to me, ideologically it didn't work for me, but in terms of that historical conjuncture for the Philippines, it was really important to go with the Cory Aquino government, to go with the possible dismantling of Ferdinand Marcos and going with someone whose whole life story is kind of weird to me, you know, Cory Aquino. But I would go with it, and because I think partly what I try, that novel certainly, and what I'm trying to do with all of my novels, is to present multiple ways in which activism happens, coming from one's different places, classes, positions, etc. So recognizing and understanding there are all these multiple ways of convergence. There is always, in my view, the best way. I mean, I'm also that, you know, so that what I feel, and I think it started with bibliolepsy, is that multiple ways of being are important to understand. It doesn't mean that you as a person do not take a very clear political stand given your understanding of everyone else, and that you go with the moment. I would go with Biden. I wouldn't be that. I don't have that. It's the moment at hand. That's the way I am. But I would go uncommitted and pressure them as much as one can. You know, so that's the way. So with bibliolepsy, I think that that division in me of recognizing that the rebellion under that group would not be as great, as free a country as I wished was there in bibliolepsy.
I'll shift that. So, you know, politically you're talking about multiple ways of converging, multiple ways that activism happens. Instead of perhaps formal politics, I want to talk about culture and resistance. Because I have like 10 questions, but I'm going to, maybe this will be the last one. So, you know, I wanted to ask you a question. I was trying to think about a question about irreverence and pettiness and
I love petty. Petty is my favorite.
That's what I was going to say. Okay, do you remember? So when you first came to campus, and I saw you in the hallway, we hadn't seen each other, and we were just talking in the hallway and being a little rowdy, and we were laughing, and you were telling these stories with a mischievous glint in your eye, and I was all like, oh, you're petty. I love it. And you're like, oh, I'm super petty. But of course there's more going on, right? Part of the joy of reading your work is in the pleasure of subversion that you offer through irreverence and pettiness and sometimes ridiculousness. Your writing practice, so it's a reading practice, but it's also a writing practice, seems to be honed through the pleasures of subversion. So I was wondering if you could just say more about, you know, creativity and history, pettiness and power, and the pleasures of subversion.
Yeah, I think one thing that I was mentioning to you, I love Jose Rizal, the Filipino writer, and I mean he's super petty. You know, if you read his letters, everything is like, you know, so petty. I mean, he's so petty that he's about to die. He's walking toward his execution. He has asked to be able to face the firing squad, so that because he does not want to die on his face. And of course they say no. He's so petty, he turns around when he's shot. So this is the story of the Philippines. The national hero, just as he's shot, he twists on his heel. And anyway, so super petty guy. I think, again, just to go back to that, you know, the history of the Philippines, which is a history of, at least the current recorded history, is a history of colonization. It's a history of trauma. And one of my thesis points at this point, in terms of reading the history, is that very likely one could imagine that this is a culture, this is a country whose a lot of the decision making, a lot of the ways of consciousness or being has to do with intergenerational trauma. You know, from, if you think about the erasure of genocide, a U.S. genocide on the country, people don't remember it. People just think about the Philippine nation as nation. It's a nation produced from U.S. occupation. And when you think about the corruptions, the really problematic politics of the country, you can trace them. You can trace them to the structures of militarism and fascism in the American, and then of course the colonization of Spain, et cetera, et cetera. It's a long history of trauma. And what are the ways that you deal with diminishment, with the ways that you're always seen in a light that is not the light that your being recognizes. Petty is a very useful spot for that. And what are the ways Filipinos do it, really? The way they pun like crazy. The punning among Filipinos is nuts. You know, you can see it in the names on like the stores. Broad Pit, for instance. Broad Pit is a store in the Philippines. They sell barbecue, but it's B-R-O-D Pit, you know, because broad means brother, but so Broad Pit, you know, or you know, or how about tinokang na talong? Tinokang na talong. If tokang means the ways in which Duterte would kill his police would kill the so-called drug addicts extrajudicially. So that the term for that is tokang. And so there's a store in, I forget where it was, Navotas Bar, that had this menu of tinokang na talong, of na EJK, na isda, you know, those kinds of things. Dark. Very dark menu, but how are you dealing with the fact that your world is so what do you call this, distorted, you know, and you're being moved into that distortion because you have to exist and survive in this world. Petty, and I think language, there's a lot of comedy in the way Filipinos will talk about everyone. My classmates, when we were little, we were like grade 2, saying, Brookie is coming, Brook Shields, you know, Brookie. So Brookie's coming, and I'm thinking, so of course it's a pun. It plays on the Filipino in a kind of gross Filipino word for some aspect of anatomy. But you know, these are little children already, you know, reading Brookie Shields in this other weird way. I mean, it's a kind of interesting resistance of the hegemonic Hollywood world making up their own ways of understanding why Imelda Marcos is inviting Brooke Shields to the Philippines and spending all that money. Anyway, whatever.
I have so many other questions, but
yeah, sorry, I had to read from Bibliolepsy.
No, I loved it. I'm sorry I couldn't pivot enough to fully engage the section that you read. I was overwhelmed. But we should do Q&A. Yeah, is that good? All right, I'm going to kick this off.
Anyone have any questions? Yes.
Hey, Brandy. Thank you.
Well, hello for another really great discussion, Gina. I have the question of just what you were speaking about right now, but also kind of tying in what you shared about fucking amidst a revolution and things like that. I feel like there's a way in which your novels and a lot of your work is also really responsive to joy, joy and happiness amidst revolution and amidst like really dramatic circumstances and crises, like personal crises, but also political crises. So I was wondering if you would like to kind of share a little bit more about that, like how you're also kind of balancing that sense of joy, the sense of laughter, hunting, celebrating that, even though it's amidst like these really devastating circumstances that are happening for people, where loved ones are dying and they're witnessing these really atrocious things, and the importance of that to revolution and spirit of revolution.
Thank you so much. Thank you for that reading of the novels. I recognize it. I recognize that I insist on another tone, another plane, when I am in fact choosing as well to write about traumatic incidents, so, and I've wondered about that with myself. I always go there. When I'm planning my books, I always go with, I guess central to that question would be, what are my books for, and so there definitely is the cognitive piece with history, the cognitive piece with how do we understand our connection to the past, how do we understand our connection to society. It's very, and I think that is a kind of cognitive level, but I as a writer need that bodily level, need that the skin, need that it's not even human, it just needs the body, needs something visceral. And for me, pleasure and joy are that, I know that my novel is working when I just feel happy writing it. And so what happens, I think, in order for me to keep writing, I find the voice that will allow that joy to happen. So I find the means for that voice to come through. I think it's important in terms of politics, because the political work that does not understand the demand on the body for anything that we're doing is not going to be as profound. If it's all cognitive, if it's all ideological, if it's all like, no, this is this, Gramsci does not say that, and Marx, all of these things, and Gramsci was very bodily, by the way, but anyway, and Marx too, his is a body politics. And I think, so I think the joy comes, the need for joy, and the embracing of joy, the embracing of pleasure in our world is really an act of resistance, because we're not allowed, just in terms of workers, we're not allowed to have, all of the obstructions against our ability to have recess, to have space apart from work, means that whenever we're not doing, whenever we're having pleasure, very likely it's a space of resistance. So pleasure, I like to find pleasure. Unfortunately, sometimes it does devolve.
But it's also really strong political power.
Yeah, I think so. Thank you. Yeah, I think so, yeah. Yeah, like those women, I keep thinking about women in war, and the only way I can think about women in war is that they need to assert that they had to have asserted either their consent to the guys to go, or their push to make people go. That they had to be part of war. They're just not seen and spoken of. Yeah.
I just wanted to ask, what your advice is to women. I'm kind of guilty of this, just being in a state where we feel like we have to be so polite, and not willing to talk about taboo things like sex and pleasure. In a world where we need to talk about this, we need to be political and activists. What is your advice to women who just are kind of stuck in their heads about things?
Yeah, just don't, just, I would say, I know it's sometimes difficult. I'm trying to imagine what it is if you're necessarily reticent and you want to be polite to everyone, and you don't. Here's one, because if you can't do it right at the top, right, when someone's being mean to you and you're like surprised, count to your head. Okay, you did that to me one time. The next time you're doing it, I'm going after you. Just figure it out. Like this first time is not. It's hard because you're surprised, but be petty, and say the next time you do that, I'm preparing this thing that I'm gonna say to you, because it is hard. You were being asked, and it to be polite too. It's nice. It's a nice thing. It creates a better environment, I guess, but it doesn't necessarily help you if you keep it to yourself. So I do that. I count. If I've noticed someone saying something not correct, I don't do it the first time. I'll maybe do it the second or, Another thing is find ways in which you center your body. And when you feel that your body is not feeling right about something, you try to kind of speak to it. I think that's kind of good. Oh, I didn't feel bad. Why did I feel bad? Also, if it moves into narcissism, that's not good. But just feel whether or not it was correct. Listen to the body.
Any other questions?
So, a question, and so I think it was when Brown once said that your community has truly arrived in a place when your ghosts appear.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm wondering, because this is your first trip, essentially of an extended stay of time where you have the opportunity to kind of navigate through the myriad of Filipino communities here in Hawaii. And I'm just wondering, or maybe it's not a fair question, and you can tell me that too, but this idea of kind of all that we bring with us, sort of this baggage and complication and history and narratives, that this, rather than move into a place with a clean slate, kind of everything comes with you, and then it becomes a layered, the multiplicity of communities and opinions, politics within the community here. I'm just wondering if you want to kind of comment on how you've been navigating this.
Well, I'm very aware here, and it's one of the reasons why I thought it would be great to come. Just in terms of that history of Hawaii with the Philippines, that kind of commingling of the history, the annexation of Hawaii, the 1898, and the world of Native Hawaiians, the indigenous world of Native Hawaiians, and thinking about. I remember I went to Bishop Museum with you, and I was really. It was very beautiful because the world of indigenous Hawaiians was so out there, so much, so centered, and so much part, and material and visible. And I've been looking for that in the Filipino world, and it is there. It is in the Filipino world, but the layerings. The Filipino world is very much a settler world. It's a settler. We have to really understand the settler aspect of the Filipino, so in terms of coming to Hawaii, so there's all the layers of Hawaiian history, and then the ways in which the Filipinos are part of that layered history. And it's a history of labor, You know, it's very much, you know, the sugar and all, you know, the plantation world, and as well as the 1965 history too of the post-Immigration Act, post-1965 Immigration Act. So there are all these different layers of Filipinos, but they're so prominent, you know, unlike in New York, you know, the Filipinos are very prominent here. So I find that there's both, again, more cognitive than it is bodily for me, because what's bodily for me in terms of thinking about Filipinos being home, being actually in the Philippines. But I'm talking to many groups, you know, many Filipinos, Kauai, here, and thinking about the many different ways they're attached to the country. And for me, it's just powerful to have groups of Filipinos who are so attached to their being Filipino, but also attached to their being here in Hawaii. They're both that way, and it's a new thing, you know. It's very new because they're kind of majority in the Filipinos.
Well, depending on how you count it, it's
Yeah.
the largest ethnic group.
Right.
How you count it.
It's so I find that interesting. But I don't have that attachment that I have when I go home. Yeah.
On the other side. Hi. Sorry. Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yeah.
Hi, Gina. Joyce. Thanks for this. I think Gina's calendar has become much more, full since she arrived here.
Yeah.
So we get a lot of all this, and I'm really thankful that we have another forum. And of course, I love the topic on women in war and bodies and minds. I just wanted to kind of maybe ask, because we also alluded in the end about the Philippines and the Filipinos. And I wanted to ask if the process of writing, especially these very historical novels, which are, as you said, are so important in Philippine history. I'm thinking whether when you write, do you know, or is it very clear which audience you write to?
Yeah.
Is it is it the Filipinos themselves and the Filipinos who, as you know, even the Philippine-American War is something that wasn't really taught to us when we were growing up, right? So, but I think now there's a bit more awareness of it, and it's primarily because of of the work of both historians and novelists who talk about the Philippine-American War. But I also noticed in terms of your reading some of your books, I haven't read all of them, but many of them, that you're also talking to the Filipinos in the diaspora. That in fact, even the kind of tone and even the kind of humor, right? I mean, I think there is a lot of Filipino humor there that for Filipinos who get the humor that it's but there's also a lot of things that I feel that really you're writing it as a Filipina in the diaspora, talking to an American Western audience, right? So
Right.
I'm just kind of asking how you navigate those two, and whether, especially in the Philippines, how people look at your novel or read your novel and see, because I know that, especially I've attended many of your events in the U.S. and how they really are very, accepting and also, like really admiring all your works, right? So I just wanted to say that in terms of the Philippines, you have the same reaction or...
Well, my novels, when I'm writing a novel, let's say Insurrecto, for instance, I'm very aware of the words that I'm using, which means that I'm also very aware of the multiple audiences that a novel might have. It's constant. It's constant. So what you're doing as a novelist is you have your character. Your character is going to be saying things, and the way that character thinks, or the consciousness of the character, is going to hit. You're going to recognize it's going to hit people in many different ways. If you're American, it's going to hit this way. If you're Filipino American from a province, it's going to hit this way. If you're Filipino American Tagalog, it's going to hit this way. If you're Filipino from Hawai'i, it's going to hit this way. If it's Filipino Tagalog, you're always recognized. Especially, I write in English. And when you're writing in a language in which you're also imagining another language in the language that you're writing, I actually constantly have to tell this to my editor. No, let's say, like there was one woman who was about writing about a novelist like me. People who have multiple worlds in them, multiple languages in them. Necessarily, when you write, you already, it's just automatic. You recognize, oh, American will read it this way. Oh, Filipino American will read it this way. And that's just what the novel is. So everyone, in my view, a good reader will understand the multiplicity of the address in each goddamned word, not just in each word. A good reader. And that's what I try to teach my students. You read Rizal. Anderson said something about Rizal, saying, why is La Consolacion speaking perfect Spanish when she's a Tagalog speaker? Well, because when Rizal was writing La Consolacion, he was imagining her speaking Tagalog. You get that? So it's the way in which, if you don't understand the way a Filipino exists, which is in multiple languages all at once, the reading might miss, certain things. But I'm trying to tell people, read more closely. Read more goddamn closely. Understand the multiplicity of the identity of the writer that you're dealing with. I'm not a white person. The same would be true, I think, of any Filipino reading me in the Philippines. Goddamn, read more closely.
So this brings us to the close of today's colloquium. And I just really want to thank